Morning, everybody. We're going to get a little bit of cueness because this is on live as well. So for the benefit of everybody, we'll try and keep a little bit quiet, not too quiet. But I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning to this particular event. It's one of those wonderful hybrid events, as we call them these days. So welcome everybody who has actually come here today. And it's the first event that we've had of this nature for a number of years in person, which is fantastic. We also have all our people online as well, which we'd like to welcome too. So Forvis Mazars are delighted to host people here, clients, some of our colleagues from work, various people here today, to give you a little bit of insight into what's happened on the budget. And I suppose it's one of these budgets where there's actually a lot of points that are actually in it that are of interest to, I suppose, a broad range of people, businesses, everybody, because when you look at the detail of what's involved in it, it is your classic election budget where everybody gets a little bit of something out of it, and maybe some less than others. So I have a number of people here with me today, some of my colleagues. We have Emer, who is one of our partners in the business advisory area. So she deals with lots of owner-managed businesses, and she'll give us some insights on that element of it. I have Alan Barrett, Dr. Alan Barrett from the ESRI. Alan was here last year. He is the chief executive of the ESRI. He has written on economics for many years, was part of the Fiscal Advisory Council. So he can give us some insights into whether or not was this the right approach, because there's much commentary, yesterday, today, beforehand as well. What do you do with all this sort of largesse that we have? Do you, give it back? Do you spend it all? Do you pay down debt, or what do you do in relation to it? Or do you do what was done, which is a little bit for everybody in relation to it? So I think we'd be interested in Alan's insights on that as well. And I also have my colleague, Cormac Kelleher. Cormac's one of our tax partners. So Cormac is actually going to deal with the tax elements of what's happened on the budget. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. So just in terms of the actual budget, I suppose, itself, it is one of those where I suppose there's maybe 3 or 4 particular aspects to it. People wanted to see what was going to happen with this money, and there is sort of a roadmap after that great windfall that came in relation to Apple that everybody frowned at, but was delighted with behind the scenes. And I'm sure it was the same down in the Department of Finance, I have no doubt, where you have 14 billion. But it is good to see a roadmap for how we're going to develop out the country, because the country certainly does need, across a range of places, a lot of investment in infrastructure, and it's been set out there, insofar as where the key ones would be housing. We're all quite well aware of that. Transport as well, which links in with the growth in the economy, water, so anything and in the energy sector as well. So there's 4 defined areas where there's going to be a lot of investment go into that over the next number of years. And that's aside from all that was earmarked in any event in the National Development Plan, which is quite a significant plan, which is from, I think, 2021 up to 2030, where, if I recollect, there was about 160 billion committed over that period of time to capital spend, which is really to, I suppose, support the growth in the economy. The economy has grown significantly in the last number of years, particularly post-COVID, and has recovered extremely well. We have high employment, 2.7 million. Employment is projected to grow again by 110,000 between this year and next year, which is fairly phenomenal. And there's lots of questions that actually come from that. And it's good to see then on the other side of it that, people who do need support, so people who are on social welfare, children, people who are looking after children, that there is actually something given back when we actually have it. Now, a lot of it is the once-off amounts, which is probably more prudent in a way, rather than sort of bedding everything in. Some are bedded in on a long-term basis in terms of social welfare. But it is good to see that. And I think it's also good to see something given back to the taxpayer at the end of the day, where effectively they see some benefits from it. So I think that's probably the key strands to what's involved in the particular budget. So separately, we have a little poll that's there, and you'll see in front of you, for anybody who's actually here in the room, that there is a QR code, and you can go in there. There's a couple of questions on it. If you could take the time to have a look at those, and just give your answers back. We'd appreciate that, and we'll come back to that particular element of it later on. And if you're online, there is a QR code that will come up online as well, so everybody should be able to participate in it. So your feedback would be really beneficial in terms of what's actually in it. So what next is, Cormac is going to be next up. So Cormac's going to get into the detail of what has happened on the tax side of it. After that then, Alan is going to give us the economic analysis. I'll come back with the poll part of it, and then we're going to have a Q&A. And everybody is welcome to raise some questions. We already have some questions that have come in online and pre the meeting. If there is anything else that you want to ask, then that would be great as well. So, Cormac.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome this morning. As Frank mentioned there, the budget is something for everyone, and we can see that in the headlines in the newspapers this morning. The words bonanza, giveaway are all being used. And I think the one that I liked the most myself was when I looked at The Independent. They went with game on. So if anyone's leaving the room here later on, Simon Harris will be on Grafton Street. He's out shaking hands, but apparently there is no election on the way. Okay, but I don't know, maybe there's a sale on or something he's going to, not sure. But anyway, as Frank mentioned, there's a lot in this budget, and this is just kind of to capture some of this because, I mean, there's a lot in it, and there's more detail by us up on our website for more comprehensive reading. So if we look at these, some of the key measures, so the 20% bands and so forth again changed this year. The single has gone up to 44, the married has gone up to 88. That's an increase from, say, for a single individual, that's 42,000 up to 44. That, if you put it in percentage terms, is about a 4.5% increase. Now, compared to where the consumer price index is, if we look at from August, that's 1.7. So in theory, that is a real increase that people should be seeing. The tax rates themselves, the 20% and the 40%, there's no change there. The USC, we expected this. I mean, if anyone picked up a newspaper last Sunday, they would have spotted this. What we're doing is what we've done in previous years as well. We've adjusted the lower bands to reflect the changes in the minimum wage, and we've also decreased the 4% rate down to 3%. Now, this is all happening with effect from the 1st of January. The 8% rate is still going to be there, so that'll still kick in when we hit the 70,000 limit. In terms of our various tax credits, so the personal, the employee earned credit, they're all increasing by €125 each. I think last budget it was about 150, so it's broadly in line. PRSI, now this was not in the budget, and this is, if you remember back to people that were watching this last year, you also got hit with a PRSI increase yesterday. This did not get mentioned in the budget. Last year's budget, though, put out a roadmap for PRSI increases. So there's a 0.1% increase that came in yesterday. Again, that wasn't in the papers. But there's also another 0.1% increase coming in October 25. And there's a PRSI growth or increase over the next number of years, all laid out in last year's budget. So you might have saved in terms of giving the employees maybe lower tax credits and maybe cash in their pocket, but it's been clawed back this way. In terms of donations, this is something that's kind of, again, changing because we possibly had something like this a number of years ago. I can't remember which minister it was, but they changed it. So for sports bodies, so at the moment where a donation is made to a sports body, the tax relief on that donation can be claimed or can be availed of by the sports organisation. So if you make a donation, you don't get any tax relief. Now, a number of years ago, that was different. That where a person made a qualifying donation, the individual could personally get the tax relief. So this is kind of a change, a rollback on that the individual can decide to get the tax relief themselves, or they can let the sporting organisation have it. So more details need to be published in the finance bill. So the finance bill is scheduled to come out on the 10th of October. So that's someday next week. And we'll have a lot more detail, a lot more meat in that on this. In terms of our energy, again, these one-off measures, this is the third year of the one-off measures. We're getting our 250. So we're going to get, that's split into two. We're going to get one in the December period, and one is kind of more the January, February billing period. Electric vehicles, I suppose the main one there is they're after changing the rules around the benefit in kind. So an employer can now provide the installation of an electric charging facility in the employee or director's own personal residence, and there is no benefit in kind. Okay, I'm sticking with my dirty diesel for the time being, but in theory, I could get it done. The 9% VAT rate, there still is a 9% VAT rate, but it is not the 9% that the hospitality sector had hoped for. It is being extended for another 6 months. That'll take us up to the end of April 25, but that's only for home heating. Okay, so that's basically to get us through the winter period, essentially. At that stage, it should go back to the 13.5%. They've also changed the VAT position on the installation costs of heat pumps. So if anyone's doing a large refurbishment on the house, the heat pump, if you wait another little bit, you'll, instead of paying 23% VAT on the installation, you'll be paying 9% on the installation. In terms of inheritances, again, if we looked at the Sunday papers, we were expecting this. So the last time we looked at this was back in 2019. Okay, so the last changes. So the thresholds that we have there are 335, 32,000 and 16,000. So these are completely out of line. Like I said, the last time there was in 2019 that we changed this. And if people remember back even further than that, the category A threshold, which is basically where a parent gives a gift to a child or a child inherits a property or a part of a property, once upon a time, that was at 557,000. So we're now going back up to 400,000, which is a good increase. It's an appreciated increase, but we're still well off where things were once upon a time. Now, this measure is actually effective today. Okay. In terms of other changes, in terms of moving on business side of things, there's a clock here I keep having to watch. In terms of retirement relief, there was changes announced last year as well in terms of capital gains tax retirement relief. And this was basically around the provisions about inheritances or kind of gifting of family businesses, okay? So there was a lot of uproar around this because it basically meant if the rules came in on the 1st of January, as they were drafted, it would basically mean that some people would have significant tax bills if they held on to the family business too long. So what they've done is they've said one of the changes that they introduced last year was around the retirement rate age of 65. Last year they proposed to increase it to 70. They're keeping that. That's a good change. We like that. But what they're after doing again, and which is again I think more logical, they're after scrapping the main issue that was there last year, and they're now saying that if a child inherits a family business or gets a gift of a family business, and that family business is retained by that individual for a 12-year period, and the value of that family business is 10 million or more, there's full capital gains tax retirement relief for the parents when they give that. However, if the family business is more than 10 million and the child gets a fabulous offer in year 10 and decides to sell it, there is a clawback of the capital gains tax relief. So the logic being is that you're trying to make sure that the children aren't getting it and, you know, deciding to sell everything and off to Australia. You're trying to make sure they hold on to the business and work that business as long as they possibly can. Small benefit exemption. We have the small benefit exemption. Again, it's been there on the statute books. There was a small change a number of years ago in COVID. There's another change. So the current threshold is 1,000. The rules at the moment say it's 1,000 up to a maximum of 2 gifts in the year. That's being changed up to 1,500 now, but that is up to 5 gifts per annum. Now, this could be beneficial because for anyone that's operating with payroll, you're having to deal with all that wonderful reporting about employee benefits, and I can see people nodding here in the room. Yeah, lots of pain, I can feel it. So this could be beneficial. So and at least if you're kind of maybe giving a voucher to someone, and then there's kind of, you know, small staff outings or other small benefits, you know, subject to this cap of 1,500, you might be captured there. So that could be beneficial from that perspective. What wasn't in the speech yesterday, but was in documentation published by Revenue overnight, is that they're proposing that this small benefit exemption change will have a shelf life up until the end of 2030. Now that sounds like a long way away, but we'll just have to keep an eye on it. In terms of cost to employer, the auto-enrollment provisions in terms of where all the contributions for employees and so forth, that's put on pause. That's now supposed to come in September of this year. My own thought is probably not. like in the sense that bringing in a huge fundamental change like that to a payroll in the middle of a tax year, probably not going to end well. So for the sake of a few more months, you would think or hope that people might kick it out till January. Sick days, again, what was supposed to happen, what we announced last year, what was supposed to happen, the paid sick days was supposed to increase to 7 from the 1st of January. That's on ice. We're sticking with the 5 for the time being. National minimum wage, again, from the 1st of January is also increasing, and that's an 80-cent increase up to €13.50. Grants, again, there's some talk in the paper again, and some of the commentary you hear from people on the radio this morning. Energy grants, there's supposed to be an energy grant of up to €4,000 paid out to qualifying businesses by the end of the year, and this is supposed to help them dealing with the cost of electricity. It's estimated that there's only about 39,000 businesses will qualify. Now, to me, that sounds like a very, very small number. In terms of funding, there's some changes. Again, we expected to see this in terms of the funding side of things because there have been consultation papers throughout the year. So the Employment and Investment Incentive Scheme, it's been extended for 2 more years. The level of investment that can be raised is being increased from 500,000 up to 1 million. The startup relief, which tends to be more aimed at people that are, starting their own business from scratch, that's also being extended for 2 years, and the level of investment is going up from 700 to 980. The R&D position, that's again changing. So 2 years ago, they introduced a cap of 25,000 in terms of accelerating the repayments. That went up to 50 last year, and that's up to 75. This is all very, very positive, and it's going down well. Just in terms of the startup exemption, that's something that's been around for a number of years. To be honest, not great. They just extended it in terms of the amount of qualifying employer, or the amount of PRSI that can be included. A small change is not really going to impact too many businesses. And Frank already mentioned the Apple funds, so nothing was really done with them, but they're kind of the 4 pillars across which they plan on spending money. In terms of property and stamp duty, they increased the rate for bulk acquisitions. So a bulk acquisition is defined as 10 or more properties. Okay, so this is typically, I suppose, aimed at the large landlords that are out there. But equally, I think there's an issue here for maybe some businesses that are trying to purchase property for their staff. I have one client, and they purchased a number of houses. They don't want to be landlords, but they just purchased property purely for their staff. They're going to be impacted by this. In terms of residential, the word being used in the paper this morning is a mansion tax. So basically, we're introducing what's called a 6% stamp duty rate, and that will kick in if the value of the property is more than 1.5 million. Residential accommodation, we introduced this a number of years ago, the tax credit. Currently, it's €750 is the tax credit for people living in rented accommodation. There's 2 changes. One is that for 2025, that's going up to €1,000 of a credit, but it's also being backdated to 2024. There were small changes again, more extensions of provisions for landlords about pre-letting expenses. This was announced last year. Didn't really have a huge impact, didn't really turn the dial too much. Help to Buy schemes is also being extended. A mortgage interest relief, which was introduced last year, is also going to be extended for another 12 months. Now, on the mortgage interest relief, I was looking at this myself this morning. I got very excited. I thought I was entitled to a credit. So if you're basically on a fixed rate last year, tough. You don't get it. But for anyone that might be on a variable rate, you might be getting a credit. In terms of indirect taxes, there's modest increases. So in terms of the registration thresholds, and again, this is all captured or laid out more so again as kind of a helping small businesses and helping them keep their cash in their pocket. The reality is, and yes, it does help them, but the reality is this is actually an EU measure. So the EU have been kind of pushing that the registration thresholds need to change. So this is being pushed at a central level down to countries. So we changed it last year, but we're after changing it again this year. So we're now up to 42,500. So again, say 2 years ago, that would have been 37.5. So it's not a huge change, but maybe for businesses that are on the cusp. Excise duty on cigarettes, that went up again by €1. Vapes, that is supposed to come in sometime in 2025. I don't really know because they haven't announced a date. They're thinking it could be sometime in the summer, and they're saying it's again going to be calculated by reference to the amount of e-liquid as they're using it in the guidance. So there's the example they use is one that currently costs €8, might cost €9.23. Flat rate farmers. This is basically the VAT rate for unregistered VAT for farmers who are not registered for VAT. That will be increasing from 1 January from 4.8% to 5.1%. Carbon taxes, again, we knew this was going to happen. This is part of our green agenda. There's a roadmap on this. So again, we've been seeing increases on this over the past number of years. It's now gone red. I'm nearly done. The carbon rate on petrol and diesel, that is scheduled to go up on the 9th of October. So fill your car before that, because that will go up by about €7.50 in that period. From May 2025, all the other fuels. So again, May is being used as, apparently it's going to be lovely and warm and we no longer need to have the heat on in May, right? And there's a couple of colleagues in the office here who I know that is not true. So that will apply. Cider and perry production, I just put it in there because again, it's an enhancement from last year. What is not on the slide and what was not in the budget was that the wine and the beers and everything were untouched. It must be the first time in history they haven't touched it. So that's just a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of the main measures in the budget. Like I said, the finance bill is scheduled to be published on the 10th, so there'll be a lot more detail and nuances there. And sometimes they give us a little surprise and just add in something that none of us knew about. So we'll watch for that, and if there's anything interesting, we'll communicate to you. So I'll hand you over.
Thanks so much. Okay, good morning, everyone, and I'll begin by thanking the colleagues at Mazars for inviting me along to talk today. So, as you can see, that my talk for the next 15 minutes, it has the title, The Economic Outlook Bracket, Some Post-Budget Thoughts. So the way I've sort of given the title might sound like this is sort of two presentations, but it's actually not. Okay, you'll see that everything I say in the first part will feed pretty much directly into what I'm going to say about the post-budget thoughts. And this is a very different talk to the one that we've just heard. This is really much more about the macroeconomics of the budget. So let's see how we get on. And again, I can see the clock over there. Okay, so I want to begin by just talking about where the economy is at right now and where we think it's going to be for the next 18 months or so. Because again, if you think about it, this is the environment that the budget feeds into. Okay, and in all truth, the story here is phenomenally positive. Okay, the Irish economy is doing remarkably well, and the expectation is it will continue on doing remarkably well for the sort of, again, over that 18-month horizon. So why is it doing so well? Well, there's a number of factors. I mean, firstly, we're partly still in a sort of a post-COVID unwinding or whatever like that, where there's a good amount of momentum in the international economy. Inflation has come down more quickly than we would have anticipated. Okay, again, if you remember at a certain point when inflation peaked, there was a sort of a lot of concern as to whether or not we were moving into a period where inflation would be sort of sticky, and there was all sorts of discussions around second round effects and everything like that. But a lot of that has dissipated, and then allied to that, of course, then has been the move towards interest rate reductions, both in the United States and in Europe. All very, very positive for the economy. And then in Ireland, we also have this remarkably strong labour market. Okay, so again, I mean, these are ESRI forecasts, but there's no great divergence of opinion here. We expect inflation to keep on coming down through 2025, and that's really, really important then in terms of real wages. When inflation was very, very high, especially in that period 2023, it meant real wages were actually declining. Okay, but with inflation coming down and nominal wage increases on the rise, real wage increases are emerging again, and that's obviously very, very important for the economy. So let's rattle through another few slides. Anytime I talk about the Irish economy, I just get totally fixated on this is one of the really, really important bits of context. Okay, so everybody knows that the multinational sector plays a really important role in the Irish economy, but you know the way there's always these discussions about trying to get a handle on, well, what precisely is the contribution? And there's always this issue because so many of the profits are exported and stuff like that, that it's not a trivial question, okay, to work out what is the contribution. Okay, but luckily, my former colleague John Fitzgerald, in a paper that the Institute published in 2023, came up with the estimates that I've produced there on the right-hand side. Okay, so John has estimated, if you go back to 2021, okay, the multinational enterprises, okay, the FDIs, were probably contributing about 29% to national income. Okay, and that was up from 22% in 2013. Just another measure here, okay, in 2021, a third of the wages paid in the Irish economy are paid by the multinational enterprises. Okay, so these are pretty substantial. Essentially what John was doing here is looking at the wages that the multinationals pay, also look at the taxes that they contribute, all right, and with a few other adjustments, that gives you a sense of how important the M&Es are to Ireland, all right? Massive, okay, absolutely massive. And again, just another important point, if you just look at employees in multinational enterprises, they account for about 10% of the workforce, but about 30% of the wage bill. These are all the really high-paying jobs, and so they have a very distinctive nature. Now, just look at the picture, okay? We don't have to spend too much time dwelling on this, but in the earlier part of that picture, again on the left-hand side, that was in the post-COVID period where the output, gross value added from the multinational sector was higher than the domestic sector. The domestic sector is the blue line. It's kind of been sort of the steady eddy there for quite a while. But strangely, the international sector, okay, and that's largely related to pharmaceuticals, has been contracting a little bit, okay, and so in many ways the growth of the economy has been dampened a little bit by the experience, but overall this is a really crucial, important part of what we're doing. Okay, we'll talk about a few components of the economy again to get a sense of where things are. So this is the picture there on the right-hand side, consumption and modified final domestic demand. The word modified comes up all the time now when we talk about the Irish economy. This is efforts to kind of strip out the funnies associated with profit repatriation and everything like that. But what you can see there in the picture, if you take the dotted blue line, that was sort of consumption in particular growing enormously highly as we came out. That goes back to early 2022. That was the immediate post-COVID period. Do you remember when all our, we weren't able to spend our money for quite a considerable period of time? What's happened then is that essentially consumption growth has sort of glided down towards a more normal level. Okay, it got quite low, all right, in the most recent period. That was related to this real wage impact that I mentioned earlier on, but we expect in the context of positive real wage growth that consumption, which is a huge part of the overall demand in the economy, is going to be on the way up. I'm not going to say a huge amount about this slide, actually. This is investment. Again, anybody who did economics back in college will remember the consumption plus investment plus government expenditure. That's the way we build up the picture of the economy. Here's investment. My favorite line here, I'm not going to talk about it. You see the green line there bouncing around all over the place? Okay, and the axis there at the bottom is minus 150, and the top axis is plus 100%. All right, that's the intellectual property moves, okay, in and out of Ireland. All right, so again, you remember the leprechaun economics year of 2015 and how a lot of our multinationals were moving intellectual property. That gets captured in investment. So it just means the investment flows are pretty wild in all truth. But to look at something a little bit more, I'm going to use the phrase concrete, no pun intended here, but if we just look at construction activity, okay, again, a number of lines going on there, but just scan your eye across the orange line. Okay, so that's actually other building and construction. Okay, so it's non-housing construction. And that's been quite weak and it's been in negative territory for quite a while. I'm going to come back to that in a little while and sort of say that's actually not bad news necessarily. The dark blue line there is dwellings. Okay, so that's housing construction. You can see it bouncing around a little bit, but let me say something more sort of focused on housing construction. Obviously, this is the great, or at least one of the great sort of preoccupations at the moment as to what's actually happening on housing. And the news here is kind of mixed. Okay, so the government, if you listen to them, and quite rightly, they continually sort of trumpet the fact that in 2023, we had 33,000 completions, and this was the highest number for an awfully long time, and it's taken as an indicator of success, and that's correctly so. Okay. A lot of government ministers are still talking about this idea that we will exceed 33,000 and that housing completions will be closer to 40,000 this year, and this is further evidence of the success of their policies. Okay, but we know already that we've only had, I see the picture there, about 12,500 completions in the year up to the middle of the year, for which we have data. So it really looks like all we're going to do this year is match last year's number. Okay, it would be very, very surprising, given where we are halfway through the year, if housing completions go beyond that. I think the graph sort of shows what a lot of government ministers are clinging on to. The light blue line there is commencements, and you can see for most of the period in the graph there, commencements translate pretty clearly within a year into completions. All right, but there's a gap opening here. We seem to have had an awful lot more commencements than we're getting completions, so that gap is there. And so we're a little bit more negative, certainly, than government ministers are. What are the difficulties? I think part of the issue there might be the sort of the high interest rates that were there previously are sort of having a lagged effect, cost of materials, constraints in the labour market. But again, we'll come back to some of those topics. Okay, I want to talk about inflation just for a couple of minutes, all right? And one of the reasons, of course, is the cost of living measures were obviously originally introduced in the context of very, very high inflation. Okay, so if you don't need to see the sort of the precise details, you just need to get an impression from the figures. So on the left-hand side of the graph, okay, that's 2023, and that's when inflation was up around the 9% mark. But you can see over the course of the last 2 years, inflation really has come down quite dramatically. Okay, and as I touched on earlier on, much more so than we would have expected. The green bit in the bar, those are the big energy hikes, okay? And you can see how they were really driving inflation for a considerable period of time. And those are the sort of things that gave rise then to the electricity credits. Energy inflation is essentially now gone, all right? There is no energy price inflation currently. And actually, the pink line that's driving things is actually restaurants and hotels. Now, this is just it's a small curiosity for me, because I know the hotels and restaurant sector, again, they were lobbying very, very hard, obviously, for the VAT reduction, okay, because they keep on sort of saying, well, they've got all these costs that they can't absorb. But somebody in the sector is actually absorbing, and they're raising prices. At a rate way beyond anybody else. Now, maybe this is leading closures, I don't know, but somebody there is doing okay. Everybody always makes this point, and it is important. Although inflation is lower, the price level has not come down. Okay, so you can sort of make the case that, well, you know, prices are higher than they were a couple of years ago, even if inflation has come down. Okay, the labour market is phenomenally strong. All right, so again, I think Frank mentioned this in his opening remarks. We're employing more people than ever in Ireland, and employment growth is really, really strong. Just one little additional point that I'd like to bring to your attention, though, and again, picture on the right-hand side. The yellow, this is generally year-on-year employment growth by citizenship. Okay, and so what you see actually is that phenomenal employment growth, a huge proportion of that has been about the hiring of non-nationals, and in particular non-EU citizens. All right, so we have in a sense been allowed and able to expand the working population as much as we have, primarily through migration. Okay, now this isn't a discussion about migration today, but I think it's a really, really important point that a lot of the growth we're talking about would simply not have happened were it not for the folks that have been flowing in. Okay, real wages. I want to get into the budget in the last 2 minutes that I will have. I've made that point already, so I'm not going to say it at great length. But remember, real wages are increasing. Okay, so let's do about 2 or 3 slides on the budget, and I'll give you my sort of sense of it. So here I'm just going to talk about the macroeconomics, okay? I might talk about some of the individual measures. But again, economics orthodoxy says fiscal policy should be counter-cyclical, okay? So this is the little sort of macroeconomic, introductory macro lesson, but you all know this anyway. And it's the old notion, okay, that when economies are booming, governments have a responsibility to, in a sense, lean against the wind. Okay, so withdraw demand at a time of great expansion. Okay, and one of the great ideas behind that, it means that when the economy goes into downturn, which it inevitably will, the government has the fiscal firepower to move in the other direction. All right, and that is the way fiscal policy is supposed to operate. And let's be clear, Irish fiscal policy has never operated on that basis. The result of which is, to use the Hearn phrase, our booms have always been boomier, okay? And my God, have our downturns been mega downturns, okay? So this is one of the reasons that we're all a little bit spooked by what's currently happening, okay? So there's always a question though, okay, about, well, what precisely is an expansionary budget and what's a contractionary budget? All right, and if I was Jack Chambers or Pascal Donohoe, I would be saying we're running a surplus, okay, close to 3% of GDP. So all this money is coming in, but we still got a surplus. But as I said there, that hides a lot. And I'm going to just quote actually Jack Chambers, who said this yesterday, but it didn't get a huge amount of attention. So what he said is, when the windfall taxes and the one-off revenue from the Court of Justice judgment, they're excluded, the underlying government deficit is 6.3 billion for this year and 5.7 billion for next year. Okay, so even the Minister of Finance himself is sort of saying, if you take away the Apple money and you take away that bit of corporate tax that nobody seems to be able to explain, okay, which is the windfall, we are running massive deficits. Okay, so by any stretch of sort of economic orthodoxy, that is just incredible. Okay. This is, again, possibly one of the most important sort of charts or tables in the budgetary document, okay? All you need to look at there is the corporation tax receipts for 2024 and 2025. See, it's about 37 billion. So about a third of Irish tax revenues are coming from corporate tax revenues. If you look across Europe, the average is about 5 to 10%, okay? So we are just stratospherically out of line, okay, with all the corporation tax revenue that's coming in. And I think in many ways, this is the thing that is really, really troubling people like me. Okay, and again, you will all be familiar with what happened with the stamp duty revenues a number of years ago. So here's the worries that I'm just going to summarize. So the Fiscal Council are majoring on this idea that the budget is inflationary. Okay, I have there on the thing, possibly that's overplayed a little bit. Okay, because we know most inflation in Ireland is actually imported. Okay, when you think about our sort of the baskets of goods that people, you know, huge amount is imported, and very often our inflation is imported rather than actually being domestically driven. Okay, so but there is it's still a concern there. I wouldn't discount it entirely. I think the bigger concern is around the vulnerability of the tax base. Okay, that when you have, you know, again, that amount of corporation tax that we don't seem to be able to sort of guarantee into the future, it's a vulnerability that is a lot of us is worrying about. I will make just another very, very brief point. Deliverability is another issue. Okay, so the government are talking about things like hiring SNIs, hiring extra guards, building extra houses. Okay, it's not clear that there are the bodies there to actually do any of that. Okay, and again, it's just one statistic I'd like to sort of throw out there. Okay, apparently, if you want to build an extra 20,000 houses, you need about 40,000 employees. All right, now, there are only 160,000 people working in construction. All right, so there isn't this huge pool of labour to build all the things that we want to build. Okay, so again, deliverability, I think, is a concern. Okay, so I'll wrap up on this very, very quickly. Look, the economy is doing remarkably well. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But it's the sustainability of the public finances, I think, are the things that are really, really worrying us. Okay, and if we look down the line, okay, there's a number of things that we know are happening. Population aging is going to happen. We're going to have to invest huge amounts in decarbonisation. Okay, so at a point when we have all those issues sitting there, the idea, say, that we would give everybody in this room an energy credit, okay, even though I'm guessing most people in these rooms, your wages have gone up over the last year, okay, that the market has looked after your cost of living squeeze. There was no need for the government to come in and do exactly the same. I'll leave it with that and we'll take questions.
Great, thank you very much, both Cormac and Alan, just in terms of their insights on that. I think there's many aspects that we can come back to in the Q&A part of it, but I'll actually go back to the poll, and thank you to everybody who actually filled that in. It's quite interesting to have a look at the particular questions, some of them around the SME, and there's a related part of that I'll have a chat with Emer on, because Emer is in the main on the OMB and SME side of it. But just in terms of the results that came in on that, is how do people perceive the overall impact of the budget for 2025? 56% said it was somewhat positive. 0% said it was very negative, which is actually a good thing. 20% neutral and about 20% very positive. So quite a mixed bag, just in the general sense of it. Second question was, do you believe the budget 2025 sufficiently addresses the challenges to businesses in the Irish economy currently? 65% said partially, but more is needed. And I think that's obviously a common thread, I think, where businesses probably do feel certainly there's a lot of costs involved in running a business, and some of that hasn't actually been addressed, probably to the level that people would actually like. So it's not surprising. And 25% said no, it misses the key issues, which I think is interesting, is 25% of people feel that there are issues, real issues within there that are actually not being addressed. And in fairness, one can see that from challenges facing certain parts of the economy where it doesn't actually have to be wasn't picked up on, and perhaps in other areas there was. So in a way, what's more needy, in terms of it. And it's interesting insofar as, in particular, say the hospitality sector is, I'm sure this morning, they're not very happy. And to see other places getting hundreds of millions. So where's the cut-off point in relation to it? The third question, what's the biggest challenge facing your businesses following the announcement of Budget 2025? 59% of people said it's rising operational costs. And that is a common theme within here, which is that the costs of doing business in Ireland are actually quite significant in every way, from wages, energy, overheads, insurance. I think everybody is aware of all of that. And I think there's an element that's the nature, I think, of the country. And I think we just probably, in a way, need to flatline out and get used to that over a period of time. And as the economy grows, it'll be more capable, or businesses will, of actually absorbing those. And then the final question was, in your opinion, does Budget 2025 do enough to support small and medium-sized SMEs? And 64% said somewhat, but more support is needed, which was the predominant part of it. And then 26% says no, it lacks significant measures. So you see, I suppose, two elements coming through there, which is more support is needed, but there's probably an element of structural change as well to support businesses of that nature. When you, particular, and Cormac touched on it earlier on about the retirement relief, where essentially it was heavily lobbied. There was all sorts of stuff in the papers last weekend about all the changes that were going to come in. And in effect, from what I can see from it, it's actually made it more difficult by extending the clawback period on retirement relief. It's actually made it more difficult, and for anybody to buy into a transfer of a business from a parent where you're taking the hit for their tax liability, which is actually what's involved in the clawback, and then you have the hit when you sell it yourself. Not the most, it's not fiscal prudence, but financial prudence if you were actually involved in something like that. So it's surprising that, in fact, they've done that. So there was a normal 6-year clawback period. So 6 years, if it's over 10 million, it's gone up to 12. Yeah, hard to fathom. So so thank you to everybody. It's much appreciated, because it actually does give us an insight sometimes when we are talking to various places as to what some of the key issues are in relation to it. So we'll take those on board, and thank you all very much indeed on it. So Emer, just to get your thoughts. I mean, you've seen some of the questions there, you've seen what's in the budget. Yeah. So what do you think the key issues are? You deal with lots of SME clients. owner-managed businesses?
Yeah, owner-managed and family businesses. And I think one of the biggest challenges that they're facing at the moment is still recruitment and retention of staff. As you can see, and as Alan had, spoken about, the level of employment, the level of unemployment, and trying to recruit, people with the appropriate skills. And this is impacting all sectors, all levels, all professions. And just, I suppose, what Alan was saying, that, the growth of the economy is very much relying on the recruitment and retention of people. Predominantly, every sector needs for their employees to be supplemented by people who are immigrating from outside of the European Union. And I suppose the attractiveness of Ireland then, I suppose, as each business has a retention and recruitment challenge, the entire economy does as well. And that it goes into, the infrastructure deficit that we have, what is the standard of living that Ireland is offering on an international scale, in terms of housing, which is, an enormous challenge for anybody who's moving to a new country and trying to establish themselves. The healthcare system also, that's another consideration for everybody, and the challenges that people have to get involved in that. So all of those infrastructural deficits, I suppose, eat away at our attractiveness as a country to come to and to make a life here. But this is the level of attractiveness that we need to have to be able to compete internationally. And I suppose just on the retention side also, housing has a huge impact on our retention of graduates. We see across all of our client base, across professional services, across everywhere, the retention of graduates and that they're not emigrating. Somebody mentioned earlier, off to Australia, it's like for people to be able to make a life and to see, a possibility of having stable living arrangements, to be able to move out of home, even to rent, and all of these things are feeding into that challenge. So I think we have a recruitment and retention challenge at both the business level and also at a national level. As you said, and it was mentioned, I suppose this time last year we were very focused on the cost of business and inflation was in a more tricky position this time last year, and now that has obviously stabilised. But it stabilised off a very high base of cost for all businesses, and I know obviously from the poll there was a strong mention of the cost of business, and that's I suppose employment related costs are a large portion of that. So employment costs and also energy, all of these things, they are still going off a very high base. So I think just general cost and being able to control costs, it's a very significant challenge. And then the cost of, I suppose, raising funds, I suppose interest rates have come down, as Alan was saying, and they look set to be stabilised now. But still, I suppose, the cost and the challenge of raising finance and tackling any sort of investor hesitancy and the things that fuel investor hesitancy, I suppose that's another challenge facing small and medium-sized businesses.
And just in terms of, say, the measures that have been outlined, and there's a lot of them that's connected together, because certainly, the availability, of housing, the ability to grow. You have certainly SME businesses, they're competing with everybody, state organisations, they're competing with multinationals for staff. Do you think that from what's been announced in the budget, that do we see daylight, or is there a lot more that needs to be done from the supports that have been put in place, or we expect to be put in place? Yeah,
well, I think the supports were pretty isolated in some ways. Lots of one-off, nothing that it'll inspire, a major change in focus for a business, or that they can leverage off to go forward. I suppose the putting money in people's pockets will hopefully feed into consumer demand and real wages and the real value of wages for employees. So that would hopefully ease off wages pressure. But from a specific perspective, there are certain sectors that will have benefit. If you're in a technology or an innovative business, and the R&D tax credit is important, well, that's positive news for you. Some on the funding side, some of these, like the employment incentives, some of the angel investment, but these are quite limited or niche. They're not very broad strokes that will impact some of the businesses, and more startup in some ways. which is great for the startups, but there are huge swathes of medium-sized businesses who will look and think there's not that much for me. There hasn't been that much that's going to impact on our business, and so I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I suppose maybe right in front of a general election is a bit much to expect for something, the more strategic side, but I think that's what's needed. And in terms of, the funding and investor hesitancy, and I think there is a lot of risk feeding into that from its, geopolitical kind of risk, and the looming election, which, the next day after the budget, that's what everybody is talking about, and the uncertainty as to what sort of environment that will bring. So I think a lot of those are still feeding in, and there's a lot of businesses, those challenges, they won't see the budget as having solved them.
Great, yeah, because I know I was actually looking at something late last night, but Mario Draghi had done some reports at an EU level, and he was looking at some of the key challenges that we face in the EU, but certainly one of the issues that came from it was literally, there needs to be a reduction in the level of red tape and regulation, and that it is really, it sort of does hold the European economy or countries back somewhat compared to probably a different approach, put like that, in the likes of the US and China in particular. Now he also wanted, us to grow our own multinationals here in Ireland or in Europe and not be so dependent. So we all have to look after, our own little patches at the end of the day. The multinationals are hugely important in here. So what's good for us, may not necessarily be good for somebody else as well. So thanks, Emer, for your insights on those. So I have a number of questions that actually have come in, and also if people here have some questions, we'll field those as well. So maybe if we go to the people who are actually here first, if anybody has a particular comment, question, something that you'd like any clarity on, put the hand up, and or as they say, shout.
Hi, Emer, thanks very much for your insights on the SME sector. As I'm Brian O'Connor, working Bank of Ireland, focusing on SMEs. Just the poll had it that the highest one, I think, was operational costs for the SME sector. As you mentioned, employee retention is a big issue. But what are you seeing in the sector overall? So we hear inflation is reducing. How are the costs impacting the sector? We hear the restaurant sector being very vocal around how cost is impacting that sector overall. I suppose, what are you seeing coming through maybe on the costs for the sector generally, and is the budget do anything for that?
From a cost perspective, employment obviously is a huge side of that. But energy, and I know, as I say, although inflation has come down, the underlying energy costs have still been very, very high base, and people struggling to deal with volatility in certain areas, things like freight, for example, and that the geopolitical uncertainty feeds into all of that, where freight literally has to go the long way around Africa, and all of these things, and the volatility, the delays, the increased costs. So I've seen, in the last 18 months, 2 years, businesses really struggle to be able to predict, control all of these costs at that level. So in terms of establishment costs, there were no measures to allay any of those establishment costs. Yes, I suppose there has been some pushing out of, I suppose the minimum wage increase is still there, and that was set out very particularly in the last budget. The auto enrolment cost, which was going to be another additional cost to business, obviously that's been pushed out a little bit. So maybe a little bit of clawing back on some of the employment costs, but I don't see there have been very many measures in this budget to help on the cost side for operational costs for businesses.
And I think one of the other issues sort of related to that is that historically, somebody I think mentioned Dáil Éireann earlier on, but many years ago, when there was sort of wage agreements being done, there was a connection between sort of the wage increases and the tax measures. So it was very much a collective. But it'll be interesting to see whether, with the increases in take-home pay that people are going to have, which is obvious, from the numbers that Cormac indicated earlier on, is that actually for businesses going to feed into a lower expectation on wage increases? And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. As mentioned, there's lots of businesses who are actually struggling with all of that. So you would hope that there would be, some benefit. And also in the likes of the hospitality and retail sector, that with the increased money in people's pockets, that they're not going to prudently save it, but they're actually going to spend it. So there's many aspects of that in relation. But thanks for your question, Brian. Does anybody else in the audience have
One for Alan, maybe a bit more strategic, but there's been talk in the past about the creation of a separate ministry for infrastructure. It wouldn't necessarily form part of the budget, but if you look at the broader discussion that's going to happen in terms of the actual taxes and infrastructure projects that might fund in the future, and it may well be for a new government or the next government. But do you have any particular view in relation to the creation of a Ministry for Infrastructure?
Good point. I have to. I mean, I tend to be left a little bit cold by the idea. I mean, just to be clear, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform a number of years ago got extra letters added, and it is around the delivery of the National Development Plan. And so there is a sort of a big chunky section within Deeper that is supposed to be, in a sense, doing what an infrastructure ministry would do. So given that this exists, I mean, the idea of taking it and putting it sort of somewhere else, I'm not sure that it would necessarily do anything that great. And there is always the consideration, constitutionally we only have 15 ministries, I think. So if you're going to create a new one, the question is, what are you not going to have? I mean, I think some people have argued that maybe higher and further education hasn't given the sort of impetus that might have been expected. But generally, as I said, it leaves me cold. And on that point about extra ministries, we might have an extra ministry for United Ireland if Sinn Féin are elected. So there seems to be plenty of competition for extra ministries.
Actually, that was one of the questions that came in online was whether does the economy have the capacity to deliver on the National Development Plan, and I think that's related to this aspect of it, and there's an economic aspect to it and managing it, which Deeper do. But there is another aspect to managing, which is literally if you have a project and it's going to be over, 5 years, how do you actually on the ground out there manage, or can we do that? Because there have been questions to date about on large infrastructure projects and our ability to...
No, I mean, just very, very quickly on that. I mean, the biggest barrier to delivery of the NDP is the availability of labour. And I think I touched on that very, very briefly if you look at the numbers that are in construction. Okay, so one of the points that was buried in my slides, but I'll just use this opportunity to talk about it very, very quickly. The decline in office building offers great opportunity actually to accelerate the National Development Plan. Okay, so we do seem to have reached this point, be it through hybrid working or just saturation or whatever it is, but we seem to be moving into a phase where we're building fewer office blocks around the country. Now, if that labour can essentially be released, it probably won't happen seamlessly. But the idea that that group of people would move into the direction of building houses could actually be a tremendously beneficial thing to happen. Because again, back to some of the points that Emer was making, I mean, housing still remains, just the critical blockage. And strangely, while I was talking earlier on about, extra government expenditure being inflationary, in that one area with housing, if you can increase housing supply, you actually will reduce house prices. So it's an expenditure that actually can have a positive impact overall and a positive impact on competitiveness. So I think the delivery in that area is absolutely critical. But as sort of reference with the Apple money, we're doing a better job of thinking about these sort of investments that you have to make sure you have the electricity and the water and all those sort of things, but you also have to have the schools and the hospitals and everything else. So I think we're getting better at it, even with some notable exceptions on specific projects. But it's really I think that's the big constraint. It's not money anymore. It's literally bodies.
And just there's another sort of slightly different question, but there's been some comments about the fact that this isn't a fiscally prudent budget in relation to it. So, and there's lots of people, the fiscal council are actually mentioned that too. So if they were designing it in a different way, what would it look like insofar as when you sort of look at all of the sort of, let's call them the competing interests that are out there and what you could do with it? What would look different?
Okay, the main thing that would look different is not giving reliefs to people who don't need them. Okay, the non-targeting of things like, if you take the energy credits, I think the energy credits are costing about, say, 500 million or something like that. Okay, I cannot see, other than people liking being given money, I cannot see any good reason to just give everybody in the country, whatever it is, €250. And just to do a thought experiment, imagine the economy was in trouble, okay, and the government decided we're going to impose a poll tax of €250 on every house. Everybody'd say that is a disgraceful idea and they'd be marching in the street, because we all have this sort of sense that you shouldn't just do everything to, because houses differ. So if it's not acceptable in terms of a house, why do we think it's a good idea to give everybody those sort of increases? So if you take the energy credits, if you take the child benefit, which of course everybody gets, okay, so that's it. I mean, I woke up, whatever yesterday morning I heard on the radio, I was getting the energy credits and I was getting the child benefit. My family does not need these. So that's just one example I would give. Generally, things like the inheritance tax issue, tax reductions at this particular point in the cycle, I just don't see any reason for them. So those are just a sort of a couple of examples that I would give where I think people like me and I mean, again, just to be clear, I mean, I think we're all conscious of the sort of the politics, and this is where economics hits politics and everything like that. So I do have sympathy with the politicians. I also think you can imagine a situation where it could have been a lot worse. You know what I mean? The expenditure could have been even more crazy. But it's not about being sort of prickly about what they've done. It really is taking that long-term look and sort of saying, in 10 or 15 years' time, could it be the case that we'd be saying, God, if only we'd sort of put a lot of that money into a fund and we could now do something with it, rather than raising taxes and cutting expenditure at exactly the time that the economy goes into recession. We're back to boom years and exaggeration.
But certainly one of the issues we come across is that our high personal tax rates can be a disincentive to people coming into the country. So in fact, if you look at what we need, on one side of it, we need to attract more people into the country. But in fact, those rates, so while I can understand the point about, do people need tax cuts, there is an element of that in the greater scheme of things where arguably to continue to attract or that talent, or actually keep them here rather than going elsewhere. Because, I mean, in the US, for instance, the top tax rate is about 38%. It's
absolutely true, but in look, send your kids to college in the United States. All about it, throwing your health insurance.
you don't want to go there.
So there's swings and roundabouts in these things, but this notion being blunt about that Ireland is losing out enormously because our tax rates are too high. I actually don't really.
You're not subscribing to it.
There may be some individuals for which, but I mean, if you look at it in Ireland, our property tax is tiny by comparison to an awful lot of countries. Social insurance, national insurance taxes are way sort of lower. And if you actually look at the average amount of tax taken in Ireland, okay, if you sort of mix all the taxes together, you find that Ireland is kind of a mid-ranking country in terms of tax take across the OECD. There's nothing terrible going on here.
Very good. Cormac, there's one question in for you, just on the vouchers, the
yes.
Small benefits exemption. That's actually, is that being totally taken away from 2030?
It's unclear. Again, there was just kind of a one-line comment in the revenue document saying that what was announced yesterday, that will basically have a shelf life up until 2030. Now, whether it's going to be completely scrapped,
appears, there's some talk about the fact that in fact the small benefit exemption, which is actually quite valuable, is actually going to be taken away in its entirety.
Yeah.
So it won't be there. So you won't even get back your €250 tax free.
Yeah.
That's what
and I suppose, look, between now and 2030, that there's a long way to go.
There's a lot of lobbying and there's an election and there's all sorts of things to do. But it is something that actually wasn't actually in the minister's speech in relation to it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And what date is it effective from? There isn't a Christmas stocking for people this year. We didn't have one.
Again, it wasn't really clear in the document, so we'd expect now next week in the finance bill to clarify if it's still 1,000 or is it 1,500 will apply this year or not. So tune in till next week.
Yeah, it is and was a very important incentive across the economy, you know, and it would be a shame to see it going, because it actually reduces that overall effective rate of tax that we were talking about earlier on. It just decreases it a little bit.
But I think it just deals with the practical things of, you know, again, because like all the changes about taking staff out for lunches or coffees and all this type of stuff. So it's back to that red tape. It's dealing with that.
Yeah, and I think from from an SME perspective, that red tape, there is no indication of any simplification. Everything is getting more complex. The reporting, real-time reporting, and that'll, I suppose, into the future we'll be getting more VAT is probably likely to come into that. But just the complexity and the cost of compliance is so high for smaller businesses, and it would, I suppose maybe the participation exemption for larger holding companies was the only thing that was looking like simplifying anything, just in terms of, but I think for small businesses, that's still a very big burden and cost.
Okay. So unless we have any final questions from the audience here, we'll wrap it up. So first I'd like to thank Alan for coming along. He really has some wonderful insights into the economic side of it, and has worked in this area for a long period of time. We appreciate that, and I think it's very good to get that sort of broader analysis of what's going on. Secondly, I'd like to thank my two colleagues here, Emer and Cormac, for all the work that they put into it. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody who has actually turned out here, and those who've actually come online as well. So if you have any questions in any aspects of the budget, just make contact with whoever your usual contact is in Forvis Mazars, and we'll be delighted to help. Most of you should have got the budget presentation document that we do every year. It's online at www.mazars.ie if you need to actually get it. So thank you all very much indeed, and have a nice day.